Great. Well, welcome everyone to the Morton Grove Public Library. We have some people here in the library, and hello to everybody at home as well. My name is Brenda. I am facilitating today's talk, but we have Greig Siedor here, who is going to be telling us about the submarine battles in World War II and the Atlantic. Just some housekeeping things, because we do have people in person and online. We're going to keep questions to the end. People on both sides will have an opportunity to ask questions. We have this booked for an hour and a half. So Greig will talk for probably a good hour or so, and then we have time for questions. I think that's it. I'm going to keep the waiting room up for just a minute so I can let anybody else in that needs to be in, but then we'll make the screen a little bit bigger. I think that is all I have. Thank you for joining us, and I will hand it over to Greig.
Thank you, Brenda. I want to add one thing. This is more likely to be closer to an hour and a half when we're all done. There's a lot of information, but I have, as I mentioned to Brenda, whatever time it takes for getting questions answered, I'm very happy to answer them. So don't feel as though that there's a time limit here. So let me start. When World War II broke out in September of 1939, it was the longest running campaign of the war, a battle between the German and British navies that ran from the very first day of the war right up to the day of the German surrender on May 7th, 1945. While the German Navy, known as the Kriegsmarine, or KM for short, had both surface ships and submarines, it quickly became apparent to Adolf Hitler that submarines were a potentially war-winning means of defeating Germany's principal opponent, Great Britain, an island nation dependent on imports for its very survival. After the war had been won, Winston Churchill made this statement. It's impossible to know today whether he was really quite so concerned. But what I want to do in this presentation is give you some sense of whether that danger posed by German submarines, known to English speakers as U-boats, could actually have been war winners for Germany. Well, it wasn't called World War II for nothing, and the submarine war was no exception. This talk would last until midnight or thereabouts if I tried to cover the undersea portion of it entirely. But before we begin, I need to know what I'm not going to cover. I need you to know what I'm not going to cover. First, we're not going to cover submarines, virtually all U.S. Navy or Imperial Japanese boats, in the Pacific Ocean. That story is huge, and U.S. subs played a major role in the defeat of Japan. But the subject is just too big for today's presentation. And second, German submarines in the Indian Ocean. The Kriegsmarine did send something like 40 U-boats to Penang on Malaya's west coast. They had two basic tasks. One was to attack Allied shipping in the Indian Ocean, and second, to trade with Japan, with critical materials like rubber and tungsten, tin and quinine going back to Germany, and German technology transferred to the Japanese military. This effort was largely a failure, as over half of the U-boats were destroyed before even arriving in Malaya. It's a fascinating topic, but it's essentially a sideshow, so I'm going to leave it there. Third, German U-boats operating in the Mediterranean Sea. This little map gives you an idea of where they got sunk. Until its surrender in September of 1943, Italy took most of the laboring ore in the Mediterranean, with some intermittent participation by German U-boats, largely at Hitler's direction to support General Rommel's Africa Corps in the North African fighting. But the Mediterranean is not hospitable for submarines. The water is too clear, and it's too shallow in many places, making it difficult for submarines to hide from counterattacking surface vessels. All but one of the U-boats that penetrated the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean Sea were eventually either lost or scuttled. Fourth, we're not going to talk about submarine warfare in the South Atlantic. U-boats and Italian submarines did operate there and took their toll on merchant shipping, in particular on Brazilian shipping, to the point where Brazil declared war on Germany and Italy in August of 1942. Brazil's participation in the war was significant. The Brazilian Navy played a major role in convoy escorting in the South Atlantic. By 1944, flying U.S.-made aircraft, the Brazilian Air Force took responsibility for anti-U-boat flights off Brazil's 4,600-mile coastline. And finally, we're not going to talk about submarine operations in the Baltic Sea. The Kriegsmarine used the Baltic for shakedown cruises of newly constructed U-boats and for training new crews. The Baltic's freezing winter weather adversely affected those efforts. Inevitably, the working up process led to numerous accidents, causing the loss of new U-boats and crew members. Little combat took place there, although the single worst loss of life on a passenger vessel did take place there on January 30th, 1945, as the former cruise ship Wilhelm Gustloff, carrying over 10,000 soldiers, sailors, and refugees from East Prussia, Poland, and the Baltics, was torpedoed and sunk with over 9,000 passengers lost. By leaving out these subjects, each one fascinating in their own regard, we can focus on the main event, the Battle of the Atlantic, in particular the struggle between the U-boats of the Kriegsmarine and merchant ships sailing to and from Great Britain in the North Atlantic and escorted by Royal Navy, Canadian Navy, and later U.S. Navy warships. Now, these are the two guys who were in charge of the German Kriegsmarine. The guy on the left, Admiral Erich Raeder, had overall command of the Kriegsmarine, with a direct report being Admiral Karl Dönitz. He was in charge of the U-boats, the submarines, as a separate force. In early 1943, it then being quite clear that German surface ships were largely impotent in helping Germany's military efforts, Hitler fired Raeder and installed Dönitz as head of the Kriegsmarine. Now, the long-term plan for the Kriegsmarine had focused on building battleships and aircraft carriers. As a consequence, only a few U-boats were available when war broke out. I'm showing you a rather, maybe you consider a strange chart. Why are we talking about World War I? Well, the German failure to build submarines in large numbers before World War II commenced is a little bit surprising, because the Kriegsmarine's experiences in World War I suggested that U-boats could devastate Britain. When Germany declared it would sink any ship on its way to Britain in February of 1917 during World War I, it had over 100 U-boats, with more arriving every month. In 1917, those U-boats were able to sink almost 2,500 ships. You can see the numbers here for February, March, April, May, and June of 17 dwarf those of earlier months. In the second half of April, one half of a month, an average of 13 ships were sunk each day. Britain was facing starvation. Yet, in September of 1939, Dönitz had only 49 submarines in all, and of those, only 20 could operate to the west of the British Isles. So here are the boats we're talking about. There are three kinds. The Type 1, at the bottom left, was the most numerous of those 49, but it was small. It could carry out patrols only in the vicinity of Great Britain and had only 6 torpedoes. Eventually, while some did serve in active combat, most ended up as training boats. The other two, the Type 7 and the Type 11, did serve in active combat, and they were much longer ranged, with 11 and 22 torpedoes, respectively. These became the principal combat U-boat designs for the remainder of the war. Now, it's important to keep in mind that U-boats are not continuously engaged in active combat. They have to travel to and from the sea areas where they were ordered to patrol. And in addition, once a U-boat returned to port, it needed to be cleaned out, supplies replenished, repairs made, which, depending on the severity, could last several months, and new equipment installed, as well as the crew being given leave time. At any one time, only about 1/3 of all U-boats were actively looking for and attacking merchant shipping. So as a practical matter, Dönitz was fighting with well less than 10 U-boats in the North Atlantic beginning in 1939. Now, I should add that living conditions on U-boats, and indeed on most submarines of this era, were atrocious. No showers, toilets backing up, fresh food soon being gone, one glass of water per day for hygiene, although it was usually used to drink because the people were thirsty constantly. When U-boats would return from patrols, cleanup crews would sometimes vomit from the odors coming from the interior. No privacy, except a little bit for the captain. Shared beds, no change of bedclothes, only one change of clothing for patrols that could last more than 3 months. God forbid if you got sick or injured, as almost none of them had doctors on board. There was no air conditioning, so temperatures in cruises near the equator were horrendously hot, over 120 degrees typically, especially if the boat was submerged for any length of time. And when the U-boat was patrolling in the North Atlantic during the winter months, condensation would form on the inside of the hull and drip, knocking out electrical connections all over the vessel. But although there was only a handful of submarines at Dönitz's disposal, they were crewed by 3,000 very experienced men, all volunteers, and their skill at destroying enemy shipping soon became apparent. So before we turn to how the Battle of the Atlantic proceeded, how close Dönitz's sailors came to starving Britain, I'd like to make sure we're all on the same page with regard to some key terms and facts. First, people call these vessels submarines, but a far better word to describe them would be submersibles. World War II undersea boats spent most of their time on the surface, not under it. They were equipped with two sources of power. First, a diesel engine that required air to operate, that is, air available only when the boat was on the surface. And second, a large series of electric batteries that would power the vessel under the water. The problem was that these batteries had only a limited amount of power, meaning the boat had to travel underwater much slower than it could on the surface, and only for a limited amount of time, typically less than 24 hours. If it operated with batteries, it would eventually have to surface in order to engage the diesel engines again, both to propel the ship and to recharge the batteries. And of course, operating below the surface meant that the crew had to rely entirely on the air contained inside for breathing. Getting to the surface was the only way to replenish that air. So when the war commenced, U-boats were based in the western Baltic Sea. I hope you can see this up here. The small Type 2 boats had a range of only about 1,900 miles, which meant they could operate only in and around the British Isles here and the North Sea, in general in this area here. The larger Type 7 and 11 boats had much longer ranges, around 13,000 miles at economical speeds, although later refinements gave them even longer legs. But New York to Liverpool, a key route for merchant ships, is a hike, over 3,000 miles in one direction, and finding and attacking targets and avoiding enemy warships ate into fuel reserves dramatically. Dönitz had some solutions for the problems of fuel, essentially mid-ocean gas stations, and we'll talk about that in a bit. The second point, quite fundamental to submarines, they're fragile. They have pressure hulls designed to resist the force of water at great depths. Most U-boats could reach 750 feet in depth, and in some cases even more. But a shell hit on the hull of that submarine while it's on the surface would render the submarine unable to escape via diving. and even worse, a breach in that hull when the boat was down deep by means of a depth charge would destroy it catastrophically. In short, submarines are vulnerable. And finally, given how low submarines are to sea level, it was difficult for them to detect target ships on the horizon, especially if the weather was bad. Typically, U-boats could see only about a 6-mile radius around the boat. Excuse me. But the U-boats had an ace up their sleeve in the form of a very talented intelligence service called B-Dienst that was able to read British coded messages from the outset of the war. This ability varied over time as the Allies would introduce changes to their coding systems and was significantly reduced in June 1943 when the Royal Navy introduced a new code for communicating with convoys and warships. Nonetheless, B-Dienst was able to help U-boats find targets for the entire war. Also of some help were air searches, which in theory are far more effective at finding enemy ships. But the Kriegsmarine had no long-range aircraft of its own. Like this Luftwaffe Condor, getting air search capacity would require the cooperation of the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe. That proved to be seriously problematic for the entire war, as it wasn't until late 1940 before any Condors were ordered to assist in searching for convoys. And in any case, the pilots and crews of those planes were ill-trained in conducting those searches. For the rest of the war, pilots would all too often give erroneous coordinates for any convoys they located. Now, for attacking convoys, Dönitz had developed so-called wolf pack tactics. Once a U-boat located a convoy, instead of attacking immediately, it would radio the convoy's location to U-boat headquarters, which would in turn order nearby U-boats to gather for a combined attack on the merchant ships in the convoy, hoping that the sheer number of U-boats would overwhelm the escorting warships. A wolf pack attack might last several days as the convoy moved to its destination, necessitating frequent messaging between the U-boats and headquarters. And of course, those messages had to be sent in code. During the entire war, U-boat headquarters controlled the movement of U-boats by means of coded messages sent with this machine, the Enigma. It is way beyond the scope of this talk to get into how this machine worked and how the Allies were eventually able to read the messages sent to and from U-boats. German leadership was convinced for the entire war that its coding was unbreakable. And indeed, at war's beginning, the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park couldn't read those messages. But over time, the Royal Navy and later the U.S. Navy had a U-boat detection system that could take advantage of the frequent radio messaging between U-boats and Dönitz's headquarters. And I'll get into that in a bit. So the primary goal of the Kriegsmarine U-boats was to sink merchant ships at a rate that would bring Great Britain to its knees. At the outset, those 49 U-boats that Dönitz had were up against a massive target. These two charts will give you an idea. The British Maritime Fleet, just Britain alone, in 1939, comprised over 3,000 ships, both cargo and tanker combined, with 17.9 million gross registered tons of carrying capacity. In addition, Britain eventually could call on the other nations shipping, Norway, for instance, to a tune of another 4 million tons. And British shipyards, while busy with warship construction and employing somewhat antiquated building methods, could still produce another 1.2 million tons per year, in addition to making repairs on damaged ships. Britain needed those vast numbers of ships, as the nation imported something between 55 and 60 million tons of goods each year in peacetime. Historically, Britain imported about 70% of its foods, cheeses, 70%, fruits, 80%, cereals and fats, 90%. 50% of its meats came from abroad. In 1942, Dönitz estimated that his force would need to sink between 400,000 and 700,000 of gross registered tons shipping each month just to match British new construction and ships that Britain would take over. The Kriegsmarine staff thought it would even be higher, perhaps as much as 1.3 million gross registered tons monthly. Keep those numbers in mind as you see some of the merchant ship loss charts in this presentation. Now, Britain had several tools in 1939 to protect its critical shipping routes. First and foremost, it began immediately using the convoy as a means of getting merchant ships to and from her shores. Convoying had proved to be immensely important to Allied fortunes in the second half of 1917, the First World War, reducing losses to U-boats to acceptable levels. Now, put simply, a convoy is simply a group of merchant ships sailing together from point A to point B, while being protected by escorting warships whose job it is to drive away and or destroy the enemy submarines, aircraft, and occasionally surface ships attacking those merchant ships. During the war, convoys were primarily of two types: fast, that is to say, ships capable of steaming at between 10 and 15 miles per hour, and slow, ships only able to move at about 6 to 9 miles per hour. Merchant ships that were faster than 15 miles per hour would be allowed to travel on their own, the thinking being that they could outrun U-boats. Ships moving at less than 6 miles per hour were also on their own, as they would cause the convoy to move too slowly. Typically, fast convoys could get across the Atlantic in about 15 days, slow ones in about 20 days. This diagram gives you an idea of what the way convoys would be typically organized. You've got the red escorts, and then the ships themselves carrying the goods, spaced accordingly. Some of them would be ammunition cargo ships, some would be tankers, some would have troops on board, others would be standard cargo ships. Please note where the ammunition and tanker ships would be located, typically in the middle. Here, the red ones are the typical location of the ammunition ships, and then tankers are blue. They're also towards the middle of the convoy. I want you to imagine what it would be like to be a sailor on an ammunition ship or a tanker carrying aviation fuel if a torpedo hit it. Now, for the Allies, convoys allowed for the movement of a lot of ships in a very small area, as opposed to those same ships operating independently, scattered all over the sea. And the convoy would have escorting warships, as you see here, whose job was to get rid of or drive away the attacking U-boats. But the Allies had to pay a price for instituting convoy, even if the convoys never encountered a single enemy U-boat. Overall, delivery rates were significantly reduced. Churchill estimated that convoying all by itself necessarily cut imports by 1/3. This is probably a little too high, but there was no doubt that by using convoying, Britain would face a substantial reduction in importing rates. We may ask, why was this so? This is a complicated subject, but shipping rates were adversely affected by, first, waiting for a group of 40 to 60 ships to come together at the departure point, instead of each one leaving one by one when it was ready. And two, convoys typically needing to zigzag or sometimes even change course in order to avoid U-boats. And three, convoys steaming only as fast as its slowest member. During the war, there were literally over 200 different convoy routes from departure point to destination point. This map shows some of the more important routes in the North and Mid-Atlantic. Please note three in particular. HX here, which denoted the fast convoys going from Halifax in Nova Scotia to Britain, SC, right above it here, which were the slow convoys from Sydney, Nova Scotia to Britain, S for slow, and PQ, just hear something up here, yeah, it's obscured right here, which were the routes from Britain to Murmansk in the north part of the Soviet Union. As you will hear, convoys on all of these routes were victims of some brutal U-boat attacks. By the way, keep in mind that ships would usually have to return to their starting point after unloading their cargo. Often they'd be empty. I think the nautical term of this is be in ballast. These returning ships would also move in convoys and also be subject to U-boat attacks. The various return convoy terms are here, OB, ON, OS, and so forth. Now, the convoy needed protection supplied by those escorting warships. When the war broke out, the British Navy had the means to locate and attack U-boats, sonar, and depth charges. U-boats frequently submerged to avoid escorts and to attack shipping. Sonar devices enabled those escorts to find a U-boat when they were underwater. Once the U-boat was located, the escorts would use depth charges in an effort to damage or destroy it. Sonar, frankly, is pretty simple in theory. Use a burst of sound into the water, loose it into the water, and see if you get a reflection back. It would bounce off an underwater object, like a submarine. It's something a little bit like radar. But it was far from perfect in locating U-boats unless they were nearby, and even less so in determining how deep they were. And importantly, sonar could not detect a U-boat if it was on the surface. U-boats would frequently attack on the surface at night, hoping they wouldn't be seen by the escorts. Depth charges simply were bombs that were thrown into the water, preset to explode at a certain depth. Detonation within 50 to 100 feet of the U-boat would cause significant damage, or it might even destroy the boat entirely. As I mentioned, U-boats could dive sometimes as low as 750 feet beneath the surface, so depth charging, at least in the beginning, was very much hit or miss, with the miss being much more likely. Another means of protecting convoys were aircraft. Planes could force U-boats to submerge, making it very difficult for them to keep up with a convoy. They could also carry depth charges and bombs to attack U-boats. Long-range aircraft like this U.S.-built B-24 could conduct searches for submarines operating on the surface. Finding a submarine could enable a convoy to be diverted away from the U-boat. But please note that these very useful long-range aircraft didn't become available until mid-1941, and even then in far too few numbers. Until then, the RAF had to rely on much shorter-ranged search planes. As a consequence, there was a large part of the North Atlantic that was simply too far away to be covered by friendly airplanes, the so-called mid-Atlantic air gap. Closing that gap would be a major goal for the Royal Navy and later for the U.S. Navy. So perhaps with that somewhat overly detailed beginning, let's turn to what actually happened between 1939 and 1945. Historians have divided the 57 months of combat in the Atlantic into a variety of groups. I'm going to keep this simple by simply talking about each year of the war. And we are going to start off with a bang, and I mean a bang literally. Most people say, correctly in my view, that the war with Germany began when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. But technically speaking, the war with Britain and France didn't start until the early afternoon on September 3rd, 1939, when ultimatums to Germany were rejected by the Germans. And as it turned out, on that very same day, a German U-boat spotted the passenger steamer Athenia off the northwest coast of Ireland on her way from Glasgow to Montreal with 1,400 passengers and crew, including 311 Americans. The captain of the U-boat thought the Athenia was a legitimate target and torpedoed her at 7:40 in the afternoon, early evening of the 3rd. And while the ship took 14 hours to sink, there were nonetheless 117 people dead, including 28 of the Americans. Well, as you can probably imagine, the outrage over this was enormous. It seemed like it was the Lusitania torpedoing of 1915 all over again. Americans couldn't believe the Germans would do such a stupid, cruel thing. The U-boat captain didn't tell headquarters what had occurred until he returned to Germany 3 weeks later. Before then, German propaganda claimed that Churchill, who was then running the Royal Navy before he became the prime minister, had the Athenia sunk deliberately in order to create animosity towards Germany. When the captain of the U-boat did report the facts, Hitler ordered the whole thing covered up, the U-boat's log edited to remove the sinking, and the crew sworn to secrecy. The truth didn't come out, actually, until the Nuremberg trials in 1946. And then in mid-October of 1939, the British battleship Royal Oak was torpedoed while in the main Royal Navy base, Scapa Flow, in the Orkney Islands north of Scotland, with 2/3 of its crew dying. That sinking was, of course, trumpeted by the German press, and the skipper of the U-boat, Günther Prien, was given a hero's welcome by the Führer himself. As embarrassing as losing the Royal Oak was, the real battle for Britain was and would always be to protect shipping. Dönitz's handful of U-boats made a good start in 1939. 147 ships sunk, over 500,000 tons of shipping, with a loss of 7 German U-boats. But actually, it could have been worse for the British. Some of you who know World War II history are aware that U.S. Navy submarines in the Pacific had serious difficulties with their torpedoes. German torpedoes also had some significant flaws that would bedevil attacks for years to come. Torpedoes would bounce off targets, others would seem to be right on target, but for some unexplained reason would fail to detonate. The mystery drove Dönitz and his U-boat commanders crazy. For the entire war, scientific developments on both sides played a huge role in determining victory or defeat. So, for example, the Kriegsmarine had developed in 1939 a magnetic mine, that is to say, explosives placed into the seabed by either U-boats or aircraft. These would detonate when a metal source, like a steamship hull, came nearby. Fortunately for the British, they discovered a misdropped magnetic mine in late 1939 and were able to develop fairly quickly countermeasures. Now, I talked about ways of locating U-boats without being able to detect or without being able to understand their coded messages. The British had developed a means of locating U-boats using their frequent radio messaging. This was called high-frequency direction finding, HFDF, inevitably, of course, called HUFDUF, after the initials. It was a simple principle. 2 or more radio receivers would detect radio beams, and using triangulation, wherever the radio signal was at its loudest, they would trace a line, and where those 2 lines would cross is where the U-boat, in this case a U-boat, would be sending its messages via radio. Now, this whole process is nowhere near as clear-cut as this simple diagram would suggest. The RAF had used high-frequency direction finding, or HUFDUF, during the 1940 Battle of Britain, but land-based receiving stations were much further away from seaborne U-boats. Given the distances involved, even a small error in drawing those lines would adversely affect their accuracy. Some of you may have already recognized that the solution to this problem is to put HUFDUF radio receivers on convoy escorts. The Royal Navy began testing an early version of shipborne HUFDUF equipment on an escort ship as early as March of 1940. Because escorting ships were much closer to those U-boats, the accuracy of those cross lines would be much higher, much better. In this diagram, it's a simple one. You have two Haftuf-equipped escorts have drawn those lines and then have communicated to the escort command vessel, who uses the information that the Haftuf equipment has generated to allow escorts to attack the U-boat. Even if that attack on the U-boat is unsuccessful, the U-boat still has had to dive. Underwater, it's unable to see the convoy, and it's too slow to keep up with it, even the slow convoys. While about 70 Royal Navy escorts had Haftuf equipment by August of 1942, it took until mid-1943 for them to be commonplace on Royal Navy ships. But of all those early scientific developments that the British created just before the war and during the early part of the war, perhaps the most significant of all was the invention of the so-called cavity magnetron. I am completely unable to tell you how it worked, but it enabled British scientists to make radar detection much more effective and, importantly, radar detection equipment much smaller. Radar as a means of locating the enemy had been around since the 1930s and, of course, had proved essential to Britain's successful defense against the German Air Force in the summer of 1940 during the Battle of Britain. But that early radar equipment was too bulky for ships or aircraft to carry. Radar using the cavity magnetron could be installed on both. In addition, it was much more powerful, meaning U-boats could be detected at longer distances. By the way, I should simply add that anybody in this audience who has a microwave has in the microwave a cavity magnetron. In August of 1940, a group of British scientists and military officers made a trip to the United States to meet with American scientific researchers. The visit became known as the Tizard mission, after the leader of the British team, Sir Henry Tizard. He's the guy in the middle there. Keep in mind at this point that the United States is legally neutral. Yet, astonishingly, the British visitors revealed a host of top secret developments, in particular the cavity magnetron, to their American hosts. The British goal was to use American manufacturing capability to build large numbers of radar systems using that device, capability which the British simply did not have then. The trip was a smashing success. There are books about it which I would encourage you to find and read. They're an amazing story. And eventually, Bell Labs in the US built 1 million cavity magnetrons of various and ever-improving designs. Now, the Tizard mission took place in the middle of 1940, a very trying time for Britain. Beginning in April to early June, Germany obliterated Denmark, Norway, and then France, leaving Britain alone to fight the Nazis. The British forces that had fought in France got out in large numbers via the Dunkirk miracle, but without equipment, even rifles. The Royal Navy lost 15 destroyers, ships critical for convoy protection, with another 27 damaged in the fighting in Norway and in bringing British and French troops off Dunkirk. The possibility of an invasion was very real, which forced the Royal Navy to keep in British waters even more warships, which could have been used to escort convoys. The armistice that ended the fighting in France gave the Kriegsmarine access to the entire French Atlantic coast, the dark brown you see here. Dönitz wasted little time in selecting new French bases for his U-boats, which would have a much shorter trip to get into the Atlantic than they faced when operating out of Germany. Here are these 5 new bases: Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, La Pallice, and Bordeaux. By November of 1940, construction of protective concrete U-boat pens commenced at these 5 locations. The photo I show you there is just one of them, the base in Lorient. During the war, despite numerous efforts, Allied bombers failed to destroy any of these 5 pens. In addition to all these troubles, Britain also had to face the fact that Italy had declared war alongside Germany in June of 1940. and brought to the table a fleet of over 100 submarines, most operating in the Mediterranean. For U-boat captains, the period after the fall of France became known as the happy time. Convoys had too few ships protecting them. A new British escort destroyer design proved to be a failure. It was too small and too short-ranged. Escort ship crews were inexperienced and frequently had little or no practice acting together before being assigned to an escort duty. Sometimes the results were devastating. German wolf packs attacked 2 October 1940 convoys from Canada to Britain that had a total of 84 ships, sinking 33 of them. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park were still unable to read the Kriegsmarine Enigma messaging. Worse yet for the British, Dönitz experts had closely examined torpedoes from a captured British submarine and soon realized why the German torpedoes were failing to detonate upon hitting a ship. Their contact fuses, which would explode the explosive material in the torpedo, those fuses were defective. The British design was considerably better and used thereafter to construct German torpedo fuses. But there was some help on the way for the Royal Navy. While the U.S. was still technically a neutral, its government had taken and was continuing to take numerous steps to aid the British. Early on, and especially after France capitulated in June of 40, Churchill had pleaded with President Roosevelt for arms and for ships. Roosevelt was somewhat hamstrung by U.S. law that mandated neutrality, but he was able to strike a controversial deal in September of 1940 that transferred 50 old World War I vintage U.S. destroyers to Britain in exchange for basing privileges at the various British locations in the Atlantic and Canada that you see here on the map on the left. Those destroyers needed considerable work to be useful. They were old and needed repairing. So even though the first of them left the U.S. in September of 1940, they didn't play a role for months to come. But they did symbolize the U.S. commitment to assist Britain as much as the law would allow. In addition, Roosevelt and the U.S. military were increasingly concerned about the ability of the U.S. to respond should it get involved in the war. In July 1940, the Congress passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act, which increased the U.S. Navy by 70%. That same summer, U.S. merchant ship building capacity was dramatically enlarged by creating 7 new shipyards on the Gulf of Mexico and Pacific coasts. Ultimately, there were dozens of yards producing cargo ships and tankers. And as you can see in this series of pictures here, building them incredibly quickly. In terms of U.S. Building of merchant vessels, we produced over 3,000 Liberty and Victory cargo ships with a total of almost 22 million gross registered tons, more than the entire British merchant ship fleet in 1939. The Germans were busy too. Impressed with their performance in the fall of 1940, Hitler agreed to a giant increase in U-boat production, 25 new submarines per month. But ramping up production capacity took time. And in any event, a U-boat needed nearly a year for construction, shakedown cruising, and the training of a new crew. So by the end of 1940, German U-boat numbers were still quite small. 16 of the ocean-going U-boats had been lost and 22 had been added. And yet this minute group was able to sink 520 merchant ships with a gross registered tonnage of almost 2.5 million tons. The total for the first 16 months was 647 ships with almost 3 million gross registered tons. The numbers for 520 were just in 1939 alone. Now, taken alone, these rather complicated numbers are a little bit misleading. Despite the lack of escorts and their inexperience, the vast majority of merchant ships steaming in a convoy to Britain made it safely. From September of 39 to December of 1940, almost 5,500 convoyed ships sailed to Britain, and of them only 133 were torpedoed. The others that were sunk, in a fairly large number, were stragglers, unable to keep up with the convoy, or ships sailing independently, or in some cases sunk somewhere else in the world besides the Atlantic Ocean. This disparity in losses of ships in convoys versus losses of ships sailing in other means, independently or otherwise, would remain in effect for the entire war. The big question, though, was whether these huge numbers of U-boats now on order would eventually create such an overwhelming force that no convoy, however well escorted, could ever survive the trip across the Atlantic. This chart, just look at the box on the left, will give you some idea of the long lead times that Dönitz and his colleagues were facing. There were fewer U-boats at sea at the end of 1940 than there were at the beginning of the war, if you add them all up. Well, 1941, an impactful year for sure, especially, of course, because we got into the war with the attack on Pearl Harbor. But before then, a number of things were going on. Until those various attacks caused the declarations of war in December between the U.S. and Japan, and then the U.S. and Italy, and the U.S. and Germany, until that point, the U.S. was still, technically, as I said, a neutral. But it certainly didn't act like one. I mentioned the Destroyers for Bases deal in 1940. In 1941, there were two other pro-British initiatives. The first was a major expansion of what was called the Neutrality Patrol off the east coast of the U.S. The U.S. indeed had engineered a diplomatic agreement with South American nations to create so-called maritime security zones, within which no belligerent acts, that is to say, submarine attacks on ships, were supposed to occur. In 1941, Roosevelt extended the U.S. East Coast zone virtually all the way east to Iceland. U.S. neutrality patrol ships would broadcast any U-boat sightings they made in those zones. And importantly, U.S. warships were now escorting merchant ships sailing to and from the United States within that extended zone, leading to confrontations with U-boats. The USS Greer engaged a U-boat in early September. The USS Kearney was torpedoed by one in mid-October, and of course, most of you know the story. On October 31st, 1941, the USS Reuben James was sunk by a U-boat, costing the lives of 100 U.S. sailors. The second major step in helping Britain was the famous Lend-Lease program, which enabled Britain to obtain goods from the United States without having to pay for them. The underlying premise was the somewhat silly notion that they were being lent with the expectation that they would be returned when they were no longer needed. These clearly non-neutral acts infuriated Hitler, but he wasn't in a position to do much about it because his army had just begun its cataclysmic invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. He couldn't add the U.S. as an enemy just yet. 41 saw a number of improvements for the British. Raids on German ships carrying critical Enigma code information enabled Bletchley Park's decoders to start reading U-boat messaging, which allowed for the diverting of convoys away from U-boat wolf packs. Enigma decryption also revealed the location of most of the supply freighters Dönitz used to provide extra fuel, food, and torpedoes to his U-boats, those mid-ocean gas stations I mentioned a while ago. In June, 9 of those supply boats were destroyed. Smaller and more effective radar equipment was now being installed on escort ships and long-range aircraft protecting convoys. The onboard and Huff-Duff systems meant escorts could find and attack U-boats more effectively. And convoys, the escorts just in general improved. The Royal Navy now had dedicated escort groups, warships and crews assigned together permanently to escort and guard convoys. Prior to May of 1941, the lack of escorts prevented convoys from being protected for the entire voyage. Now there were enough escort vessels to allow for all convoys to be defended all the way across the Atlantic. There was a change, too, in what convoys were made up of. Until mid-41, ships capable of steaming at 13 knots or faster were allowed to proceed on their own, that is to say, independently. But too many of them had been lost. In the April to June of 41 quarter, 120 were lost. So the Royal Navy implemented a change to require all ships of 15 knots or less to be in a convoy. This change proved effective. Independent losses had dropped to only 49 ships in the following 6 months, June to December of 41. And in addition, 3 very successful U-boat commanders were either lost or captured, all during March of 1941. Otto Kretschmer, Günther Prien, and Joachim Schepke, who in all had sunk just by themselves 113 ships of almost 600,000 tons. Their experience and their talent would sorely be missed sorely by the Kriegsmarine later in the war. 1941, though, brought its own challenges. There were still way too few escorts and way too few long-range airplanes. The British developed a couple of new methods to dealing with the lack of aircraft. One was clearly a stopgap measure. They installed Hurricane fighter planes on some merchant ships. They could be catapulted into the air to deal with German Condor bombers that the Germans would use to either track or attack or both convoys. The plane had no place to land, and as a result, the pilot was forced to ditch in the ocean and in hopes of being rescued. The second means, frankly, a much better one, and one that had long-term potential, was the development of the small escort aircraft carrier like this one, the HMS Audacity. This was the first one of them. It was a converted freighter. That conversion process allowed for no hangar deck underneath the flight deck, so all 8 of the fighter planes that it normally carried, you only have 6 here, were kept on the flight deck permanently. HMS Audacity was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine in December of 41. But the concept of escort carriers proved very successful, as you will hear. Now, knowing the history of the war, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 41 was initially very successful. The Soviets were getting clobbered. Stalin was screaming for help. In order to help, convoys from Scotland via Iceland to Murmansk were commencing in the August of 1941. You can see there are 2 routes here, one during the winter and one during the summer, all designed to avoid German ships and German aircraft operating out of Norway. Initially, those convoys went very well. All 8 of ones going to Russia made it without a loss in 1941, as did 4 return convoys carrying the ships basically empty, coming back to Britain. But as you will hear, that happy story would change dramatically in 1942. So, summing up 41. Only 2.5% of the ships in convoy, 291 out of 12,000, were destroyed. But only 35 U-boats of all types were lost, and that was from all causes, not just combat, training accidents and the like. But one important piece of data is that by the end of this year, 1941, 2,400 U-boat crewmen and captains had been lost, many from the cream of that pre-war German submarine force. Britain had lost a little over 5 million tons of shipping, but it had built 2 million tons, confiscated or leased or purchased another 4 million tons. The net result was that the British had more shipping at the end of 1941 than it had before the war began. So, in short, as painful as 1941 was, Dönitz's U-boats were not winning the battle. Not yet. As you can see, those newly built and commissioned U-boats were beginning to show up. There, in fact, were enough of them that, over Dönitz's objections, Hitler ordered some of them to go to the Mediterranean Sea. So now we turn to 1942, the second happy time, and some disasters. So even though the U.S. had begun a huge increase in shipbuilding well before Pearl Harbor, it simply was not ready for all-out war when 1942 began. There were new areas of operation for U-boats in 1942 off the East Coast and the Caribbean. The problem was a familiar one. Too few ships, too few aircraft, too little training, and way too much to do. Now, U.S. military commanders were hoping to mount an invasion of Europe in 1942, which meant that U.S. troops and equipment had to be shipped to Britain in large numbers. The Navy was frightened of the public outcry if troop ships were sunk en route. So the 30-odd troopship convoys in the Atlantic had huge escorts that prevented any losses. But this left the anti-submarine defenses of the East Coast and the Caribbean with too little resources to defend merchant ships. The U-boats sent to these new areas of operation enjoyed a second happy time. From December of 41 to August of 42, when the U-boats were effectively withdrawn by Dönitz from the waters of the East and Gulf coasts and the Caribbean, over 600 ships, 3 million plus tons, were destroyed by U-boats at a cost of just 22 U-boats being sunk. Oil tankers were particularly hard hit. Over 140 were lost in those two areas as a whole. Indeed, over that period of time, the Allies lost 210 tankers and only were able to build 92. This was a worrisome trend because tankers are critical to enabling the war to continue. Other shocks hit the convoys. In early 1942, the Kriegsmarine began using a far more complicated Enigma coding machine. The result? Bletchley Park decoders were unable to read U-boat messages for almost all of 1942. Worse yet was the fact that the German intelligence service, the B-Dienst I spoke of earlier, was able to read British naval codes beginning in March of 1942. And you will recall that the surface ships used by the Kriegsmarine to replenish fuel and supplies for U-boats had been detected and largely destroyed by the Royal Navy in 1941, in June of 41. In response, the milk cow supply submarines were developed. You see one here in the background. There's a U-boat on the front waiting to be tied up to start replenishing fuel, food. The milch cows actually had a doctor to treat wounds. And because of the capacity of these milk cow submarines, they could extend the patrols of standard U-boats as many as 5 different times. So 5 different U-boats could be fueled and supplied from those boats. In January of 1942, one of Dönitz's U-boat commanders discovered why German torpedoes were apparently heading towards enemy ships but not exploding. They were running too deep. They were running underneath the ships. This was the second and the last defect needing correction, and as a result, rendered U-boat torpedo attacks even more effective than ever before. But that tech war didn't always go in favor of the Kriegsmarine. Because U-boats now were largely based in those 5 French ports, they had to traverse the Bay of Biscay to get into the Atlantic, usually traveling on the surface at night in order to get to their patrol areas more quickly. In June of 1942, RAF Coastal Command, now operating under the Royal Navy, started using the combination of airborne radar and a clever device called the Lee light, named after its inventor, to detect and attack those submarines. It turned out that radar didn't work particularly well when an RAF bombing plane, got near a U-boat. So as it got near to the U-boat, it would turn on this extremely powerful Lee light, was attached to a wing, as you can see in the right-hand picture, to illuminate the sub for an attack. Its first success was the next month, July of 42. Dönitz belatedly realized the Allies now had a radar system small enough to be installed in aircraft, and demanded that German scientists develop a radar detector for his U-boats that would allow them to submerge before the enemy plane could attack by detecting the radar beams. By September of 1942, he had one called METOX, M-E-T-O-X, and began installing it on his U-boats. Unfortunately for him, Allied scientists had developed even better radar systems for airplanes. METOX couldn't detect those radar beams using the METOX equipment. There are other Allied improvements as well. The second-generation depth charge system known as the Hedgehog was developed. Standard depth charges would destroy a submarine if they exploded in close proximity. But they were all set to go off at one point or another during their descent in the ocean. And when they did go off, they ruined the ability of the surface ship's sonar system to maintain a contact on the submarine. The Hedgehog bomb would explode only when it actually struck the U-boat. If the 24 bombs that you see here, then when they were launched, missed, there was no obscuring noise with the ship's sonar. To give you an idea of how they would work, they would be launched in sort of a circular pattern in front of the ship. And if they hit the submarine, the resulting explosion would usually be enough to destroy it. That's what happened here to the U-853 off Block Island in 1945. But the Allies have to deal with an ever-increasing number of U-boats, as the building campaign now is in full swing. Remember, this is a chart of only patrolling U-boats. Twice as many are either returning to port, going through shakedowns, or training. Dönitz now has a formidable weapon, and it's getting bigger. And that weapon is having some major successes. One disaster occurred in July of 42 with the Russia-bound 33-ship convoy PQ-17. Because of a major blunder by the Royal Navy, the merchant ships were told to scatter and thus lost the benefit of escorting warships. Eventually, only 9 of the 33 were able to make it to Murmansk. Of the other 24, they were lost to a combination of air and U-boat attacks. The subsequent PQ-18 convoy was also devastated, 13 out of 40 ships being sunk. As a consequence, Churchill ordered that Murmansk convoys be halted until later in the year, when longer nights would help the convoys avoid aircraft and U-boats. Other convoys to Britain were also hit hard. SC-94, with 35 ships heading in August of 42, lost 11 ships. 42 ships from West Africa to Liverpool in September of 42, attacked by 10 U-boats and lost 12 ships, while German intelligence directed a wolf pack of 17 U-boats to a 39-ship Canada to Liverpool convoy in October, with 15 merchant ships being lost. I could give you lots more examples. Viewing statistics alone, you would have to conclude that the Kriegsmarine U-boats had a spectacular 1942. Another 1,155 ships, 6.1 million tons, all lost. November alone was staggering. 800,000 tons of shipping demolished. Including losses caused by other means, like aircraft, the Allies lost almost 1,700 ships during the year. Now, their U-boats were destroyed as well, 86, but many more new U-boats were coming into combat. The merchant ship loss to U-boat loss ratio was 19-1 plus, 19 ships for every U-boat lost. But again, if you focus just on the North Atlantic convoys, the really key ones, the picture is a little different. 5,000 ships were steaming across the Atlantic in a convoy from North America and from Africa. Of those, 173 were victims, a loss rate of less than 3.5%. And this next chart's a little hard to, I think, absorb it. That crooked red line with black interior gives you the idea of the difference between losses of ships to submarines and construction of new shipping. And as you can see, in general, in 42, and then particularly in 43 and 44, new construction vastly outnumbers losses. And the same is true for tankers. It's pretty clear by the end of 1942 that Dönitz's men are not going to be able to sink enough ships to win the supply war. But this is building ships now. Getting sailors to man those ships is another thing. It was becoming obvious that there were so many U-boats at sea that the strategy of trying to avoid them was becoming increasingly difficult. It was imperative that the Allies improve their ability to find and sink U-boats before they could destroy merchant ships and their crews. Well, there was more help on the way. Britain and the U.S. were building many more escort aircraft carriers. 11 were operational in the Atlantic by the end of 1942. They carried small numbers of aircraft, but those aircraft could seek out and attack U-boats. The Huff-Duff system became more effective at finding U-boats because of the addition of listening stations set up on the U.S. East Coast, as well as more Huff-Duff installations on escorting warships. And most critically, Allied code breakers had finally broken that improved Enigma ciphering system in December of 1942. Messages still took time to decode, but the information provided useful information for guiding convoys and attacking U-boats. One more important development in 1942, and we'll talk a little bit about this now and a little bit later. By the fall of that year, Dönitz had come to the conclusion that his U-boats were just simply becoming obsolete in the face of ever-improving Allied weaponry and tactics. He needed a new generation of U-boats that could travel faster and longer underwater. Two possibilities were identified. One, using hydrogen peroxide as a fuel, was rejected as infeasible. The second, though, was a major redesign of existing U-boats to provide both a more streamlined hull and much bigger batteries that would enable the submarine to travel underwater for 90 minutes at speeds as fast, if not faster, than the Allied escorting ships. In November of 1942, the concept of a new so-called electro boat was accepted and design work begun. This picture is of the U-2540. It is the only surviving floating example of the electro boat, and it is a precursor to a number of post-war submarine designs. Notice how sleek it looks compared to the Type 7 and Type 11 U-boats. You would be forgiven in thinking this is a much more modern ship than one built in 1944 or 1945. Well, by the beginning of 43, there were two countervailing trends at work in the Battle of the Atlantic. Ever-increasing numbers of U-boats operating in the North Atlantic and ever-increasing Allied anti-submarine equipment and ever-improving Allied training and tactics. Which trend would prevail? Well, if you looked at the statistics for just the first 4 months of 1943, you'd be forgiven if you concluded that Dönitz's forces had the upper hand. Worldwide, from January through April, those 4 months of 1943, 271 ships, 1.6 million tons. On the crucial North Atlantic convoy route, those same 4 months saw 59 convoys with 2,400 ships, but 111 of them were sunk. Now it's at a 5% loss of rate. German intelligence was still able to read those British naval codes, allowing it to direct U-boats to convoy locations. March alone had 4 North Atlantic convoys with about 200 ships. They lost 39 ships. Now we're talking about a 20% loss rate. Royal Navy leadership was beginning to question the viability of the entire convoy system and had absolutely nothing by way of a backup plan. But the truth of the matter was that 12 other convoys in March got through without a single loss. While the number of U-boats operating in the Atlantic did increase over those months, the increase was only marginal, 157 on January 1st to 186 on May 1st. And then in May, an almost unbelievably dramatic turnaround. German codebreakers were able to lead dozens of U-boats to attack 6 more convoys with 277 ships in mid-May. But only 6 of those merchant ships were lost, and not a single one was lost during the remainder of the month. In return, Allied aircraft and escorts sank 15 German U-boats, damaging another 8. One of those U-boats sent to the bottom was the U-954, with Dönitz's son Peter on board. No survivors. Overall, in May of 1943 alone, 42 U-boats were sunk, more than had been lost than in all of 1941. May became known as Black May. Dönitz recognized his men were defeated on the North Atlantic and ordered them to abandon those routes. They returned again in the autumn, but they never regained the momentum of early 1943. This chart of U-boats on patrol during 1943 tells the story. Despite large numbers of newly constructed U-boats, about 20 per month, Dönitz was never able to match the size of his May 1943 force. For the remainder of 1943, another, unbelievably, 142 U-boats were sunk. Worse yet was the loss of so many experienced U-boat crews, especially the captains and young officers who would have been promoted to command the newly arriving U-boats. One point that deserves emphasizing: experience in U-boat commanders meant a great deal. During the entire war, just 30 U-boat commanders, i.e. 2% of all of them, accounted for 30% of all 30% of all Allied shipping sunk. In fact, 14 of them took care of 20% of all Allied losses. And you can look at this business of experience another way. 75% of all commissioned boats, 850 in all during the war, 75% of them sank not a single ship during the war. Dönitz and Hitler met at the end of May of 1943 to take stock. Hitler recognized the horrendous losses U-boats were now suffering, but insisted that Dönitz's men keep going. His fear was that if the U-boat campaign ended, the Allies would use the massive resources it was devoting to convoy protection elsewhere in the war, ultimately to Germany's detriment. So what caused this turnaround? Well, I've mentioned some of it already. One is better anti-submarine warfare weapons, like this one. This stubby-looking little thing, actually it's called a torpedo, but it was actually a homing device. It was an acoustic torpedo developed to detect and then head towards the sounds of an operating U-boat. When it would hit it, it would explode, destroying the U-boat. It was very successful. 200 of them were used during the course of the war, sinking 37 enemy submarines, including some Japanese submarines. Another 18 were damaged. Those attacks on U-boats going through the Bay of Biscay I mentioned earlier were now carried out in force during the summer of 1943. Coastal Command bombers had those radar sets that the German U-boats couldn't detect. The combination of the improved radar and the lee lights resulted in 22 more U-boats being sunk from May through early August. In May of 43, German intelligence accidentally and inadvertently revealed that it was reading British naval codes. The Royal Navy immediately responded with a new set of codes, and that cut that source of information for the Germans off for the rest of the year and the rest of the war. The Central North Atlantic air gap, which had so bedeviled the convoys earlier, was finally closed. Those B-24s were now increasingly available, escort carriers in sufficient numbers now to allow their aircraft to go on the offensive, that is to say, to look for U-boats wherever they might be. And in October of 1943, the Portuguese government gave the Allies permission to base anti-submarine warfare aircraft in the Azores, which then finally closed that gap once and for all. You also had the development of so-called MAC ships, merchant aircraft carriers. It would be freighters and tankers that would have a small flight deck installed on top. Now they could fly in small attack planes like these Fairey Swordfish bombers, torpedo bombers. They could take off and land on the same ship. By September, U.S. and British codebreakers were able to decode U-boat messaging via the Enigma machine within 24 hours, giving the Allies a powerful tool to use against U-boats all over the world. And that advantage lasted the rest of the war. 3/4 of those floating U-boat gas stations, the milk cows I mentioned earlier, were located and sunk between May and August of 43. And by October of 43, there was only one still afloat. The failure of the U-boat was plain from these numbers. This chart gives you another way of looking at the loss and the defeat of the U-boats. Those are the ratio of merchant ships sunk versus U-boats sunk from September of 42 to December of 43. Look at November. A half of a merchant ship per U-boat. I could end this presentation, quite frankly, right now. 1944 and 1945 continued the slaughter of the U-boats and their crews. The last 17 months of the war had 188 merchant ships lost to U-boats around the world, and 370 U-boats sunk for all causes, one ship per 2 U-boats. But I don't want to end this without mentioning and going in some detail into 2 very important U-boat design developments, part of Dönitz' desperate attempts to turn the tide. First was the installation of the so-called snorkels on all U-boats, beginning in 1943. Snorkel is a simple device, and it's a means of drawing in air while a U-boat was submerged, while allowing the U-boat to run its diesel engines underwater with an exhaust going out to the above the ship into the air. Dutch submarine designers had included a snorkel in pre-war Dutch submarines, which had been captured by the Germans in 1940. Because of the disruptions in the manufacturing, delivery, and installation of snorkels from Allied air attacks on U-boat construction sites, less than half of the submarines that Dönitz had installed snorkels when D-Day took place in June of 44. And the only part of the submarine that would be visible above the surface was the intake portion of the snorkel shaft. Because of this, radar detection was more difficult. The latest version of Allied radar could detect a snorkel at about 3 miles, and sometimes the diesel smoke coming off the top of the snorkel could be seen as well. U-boats with snorkels typically use them sparingly, 4 hours a day, usually to recharge batteries. Otherwise, they operated with batteries at very slow speeds, 5 knots, 6 miles per hour or so, or less. If a U-boat ran its diesels underwater, the noise of those diesels prevented the use of any sort of listening devices to locate enemy shipping. And if it was running on batteries, it had to keep its speed down to 1 or 2 knots in order to use its periscope. Speeds much above that would cause damaging vibrations to the periscope. So in short, the snorkel was very much a mixed blessing. It was also intensely disliked by crews. When the intake valve closed, for example, due to a wave washing over it, while the diesels were running, there would be a very painful drop in air pressure inside the submarine. You can imagine what it did to eardrums. Moreover, it would sometimes leak, causing the diesels to emit fumes and carbon monoxide. Finally, since the point of the snorkel was to allow the U-boat to run entirely underwater, they were slow, usually not more than about 60 miles per day. Which brings us to the second development, the one I mentioned earlier, the electroboat. German engineers had worked up a set of plans for this new generation of U-boats by June of 43. And Hitler's approval for the commencement of construction was given in August. There were to be two designs, a large ocean-going boat, a Type 21, and a smaller version suitable for shallow waters, for example, the North Sea or the Mediterranean Sea, a Type 23. Had these two crafts been built the conventional way, none would have been available until late 1944, and a full contingent not until 1946. This was deemed far too slow, so plans were made to have the electroboats constructed in modular fashion, the larger Type 21s having 7 sections, and the Type 23s in 4 sections, all built in various locations across Germany and sent by barge or rail to the shipyards where those components would be assembled and the boat launched. This method of construction this method cut the time of construction down to about 6 months. Had Germany been building these new designs much earlier, they might have made a difference. Their range and speed underwater was far better than any existing submarine of any nation. They had automatic torpedo loading mechanisms that could load a second round of torpedoes in 5 minutes. They were designed to dive to 1,200 feet, twice the depth limit of U.S. Navy submarines. But the rushed process of construction, the chaos that was Germany from late 1943 to the end of the war, the sustained U.S. Army Air Force and Royal Air Force Bomber Command raids on U-boat construction sites. There were over 100 raids in 1943 and 44, 60 of which had more than 100 aircraft involved. All of this, plus some poor design decisions, combined to make the U-boats less than a war-winning weapon. Sloppy modular construction by firms not sufficiently experienced in the building of submarines caused the actual depth limit to be less than that of conventional U-boats. The diesels were supposed to have superchargers, but they didn't work. And the electroboats were thus actually slower on the surface than the regular Type 11 U-boats. The hydraulic gear, which ran the rudders, the diving planes, the torpedo doors, and so on, were installed outside the pressure hull, rendering them subject to saltwater corrosion, battle damage, and of course, being incapable of repair while at sea. And the snorkels are no better than those installed on older boats. In the end, some 119 of the Type 21s and 61 of the smaller Type 23s were commissioned. But only one of the big ones and 6 of the small ones were actually fully ready for combat by war's end. One of the small boats sank a freighter off the east coast of Scotland in February of 45. And sadly, the same day, the very same day, the war in Europe ended, May 7th, 1945, a Type 23 sank 2 freighters, including the one pictured here, with 9 men dying. So, bottom line, was Churchill, writing here after the war was over, right about the threat of the U-boats? I could throw a whole lot of additional numbers at you, and you'd leave this presentation grumbling about how boring this guy was. So I'll give you only 3 other data points. There were 28,000 individual convoys during the war, 320,000 ships. 2,900 of them were sunk, a loss rate of less than 1 in 100 due to U-boat attack during the entire war. The U.S. built 5,800 merchant ships, 2,200 million gross registered tons. Britain itself started with almost 22 million. And of course, Britain and Canada had made their own contributions to merchant ships construction. Put it all together, there's no way the U-boats were going to come close to sinking enough ships. And finally, the three principal routes for ships carrying supplies to Great Britain had a total of 628 convoys, 27,000 ships in all. 1 in 63 was sunk by U-boats. So, do we therefore dismiss Churchill's anxiety as overwrought, conclude that at no time there was any realistic chance for the U-boats to defeat Britain or the Allies? I think the answer, with one very large caveat, is yes. It wasn't going to happen. But my caveat lies in the fact that we are viewing all of this very much in hindsight. Put yourself in Churchill's shoes on March 31st, 1943. Over the past 15 months, from January to March to now, U-boats have sunk almost 1,400 ships, 7.5 million tons. That's 92 ships per month. And it looks like it's only going to get worse. There's that same chart I've shown you a couple of times. The Allies didn't have the level of precision about U-boat populations that this chart would show you, but they knew there were a lot more than the North Atlantic, and that overall U-boats were being built faster than they were being destroyed. Where is that red line going to be in 6 months or in 12 months? In short, that astonishing turnaround that began in May of 1943 was still in the future. The Allies had a lot of pieces of the puzzle coming together, but in March they weren't in place yet, and it wasn't clear that they would ever be in place. Now, we noted how new merchant ship construction was well in excess of those losses. But how are you going to be able to recruit sailors in the face of huge casualty rates? Which brings me to my last slide, and I'll be done, and I'll be happy to answer questions. This is the Mercantile Marine Memorial in London. And I'm sorry to say I've been to London a number of times. I've never seen this. I've got to go see it next time I go. 50,000 men died in merchant ships during the war, 2/3 of them from Britain or the Commonwealth countries. 1 in 4 of all British merchant sailors were killed. The U.S. on its own lost 10,000 sailors, about 4% of all, some of those, of course, in the Pacific. And what of the U-boat crewmen? During the war, 3/4 of them, 3/4 of the 40,000 men who served on U-boats died. All I can say is, what an incredible waste. Thank you.